Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. Elias Ward rode along the narrow trail that cut across the valley floor, his horse moving at a steady walk as dusk settled behind the ridge. He had finished repairing a collapsed fence on his own land and was heading home when he noticed something that tightened his stomach. A quiet cabin at the far edge of the valley with no smoke rising from its chimney. At this hour, every home in the valley had a fire going. Only one did not. He slowed his horse and stared toward the structure. Nayeli's cabin. Elias didn't know her well. She was a widowed Apache woman who kept to herself, lived off a small patch of land, and avoided unnecessary conversation. Since her husband's death a year before, she handled everything alone. She rarely asked for help, even when she needed it. Elias understood that kind of isolation. He had lived the same way after losing his younger brother in a gunfight he blamed himself for. Since then, he avoided crowds, traveling, and anything that pushed him into explanations he didn't want to give. Working the land and keeping distance from people was the only way he felt steady. But a cabin without smoke in winter meant trouble, fever, injury, or loss of strength. He felt a small pulse of tension in his chest. If she's in real danger and I ignore it, I'll carry that weight too. He turned his horse and headed toward her place. The closer he rode, the clearer the signs became. No lantern light through the window. No movement. No sound of tools or firewood being stacked. He dismounted, tied his horse to the fence rail, and stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked under his boots. He knocked once. No answer. His jaw tightened, not from impatience, but from uncertainty. He didn't want to intrude or disrespect her space, but the silence pushed him past hesitation. He opened the door slightly and called inside. Nayeli? It's Elias Ward. You all right? His voice carried through the dim room. Still no reply. He stepped in. The cabin was colder than the air outside. The fire in the stone hearth had been dead for hours. Lantern light barely reached across the floor. Nayeli lay on a small bed near the back wall, curled under a thin blanket. Her clothes were wet, soaked through, as if she had walked in heavy rain. Her hair clung to her neck. Her breathing was shallow, irregular. Elias crossed the room quickly, the seriousness of the situation pushing away any hesitation. He placed a hand on her shoulder. Her skin felt cold. Her body trembled under the blanket. Nayeli, wake up. Her eyes opened slightly, unfocused and glossy. She tried to speak, but only managed a weak sound. He smelled damp earth and cold air on her clothes. She must have walked miles in the storm that passed earlier. Fear tightened his throat. If she stays like this another hour, she won't make it. He spoke quietly, keeping his voice steady. You're freezing. I'm going to help you. Just stay with me. She blinked slowly, unable to respond. Elias moved with careful, deliberate motions. He took off his coat and draped it over her legs. Then he checked her clothes, went all the way through, pulling heat out of her body. He hesitated for a moment, aware of the line between helping and intruding, but the urgency left no room for pride or overthinking. Your clothes are soaked. I'm going to get you dry, he said, speaking aloud so she understood his intent. She didn't resist. He knelt beside the bed and untied her wet shoes. They slid off easily, cold and heavy with water. He set them aside and pressed a dry blanket around her feet. Then he lifted her gently to remove her damp shirt, working slowly so she wouldn't panic or feel vulnerable. He replaced it with a clean, dry shirt from a trunk at the foot of her bed. Her breathing steadied slightly. Her eyes closed, not in fear, but in exhaustion. Elias wrapped 2 wool blankets around her shoulders and arms, tucking them in to trap warmth. He lit the fire next. His hands moved fast but precise, stacking tinder, striking flint, feeding the first small flame. The warmth spread slowly through the cabin, pushing back the cold that had seeped into the walls. While the fire grew, Elias looked at her face. Her features were strained, cheeks flushed with fever. Despite the exhaustion in her expression, there was something steady beneath it, a woman used to fighting through hardship. He pulled a chair closer to her bed and sat, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. His thoughts were restless and heavy. Why was she out in the storm? Why didn't she ask anyone for help? How long had she been lying here alone? He felt a mixture of worry and frustration. Worry for her condition, frustration that this valley left people so alone that they pushed past their limits before seeking help. He stayed beside her as the fire expanded, filling the cabin with slow, rising heat. After a while, Nayeli stirred. Her voice was weak. "You came here?" Elias nodded. "No smoke from your chimney. Didn't sit right with me." She closed her eyes again, breathing unevenly. "I tried to make a home. Lost strength. You're all right now. Just rest." His voice remained low, clear, and free of false comfort. He didn't promise anything he couldn't control. He only gave her the truth. He was here, and he wasn't leaving until she improved. The night settled deeper around them. The only sounds were the crackling fire, her slow breaths, and the wind pressing softly against the walls. Elias monitored her fever with quiet attention, adjusting blankets when she shivered and adding wood to the fire whenever the flames weakened. His mind stayed alert, running through practical steps, how to warm her slowly, how to judge the fever, how to keep her hydrated when she could swallow again. But beneath the calm actions, something else stirred, a protective impulse he hadn't felt in years. He didn't understand it fully, but he didn't push it away. For the first time since his brother's death, he felt that helping someone didn't drag him back into old pain. It steadied him. Hours passed. Her breathing evened out. Her heartbeat slowed to a safer rhythm. She drifted into a deeper sleep, no longer shaking. Elias exhaled slowly, tension draining from his shoulders. He kept his seat by the bed, watching the fire reflect across the room. He wasn't here out of obligation. He wasn't here because he owed her anything. He was here because he didn't want another person in this valley facing darkness alone. This thought settled in his mind like a quiet decision. When dawn came, he would still be sitting in that chair. And for the first time in a long time, that felt right. The fire held through the night, its steady glow pushing the cold away from the cabin walls. Elias stayed awake in the chair beside Nayeli, his back stiff and his eyes burning, but he did not move far. The moment her breathing had evened out, something inside him settled as well. The storm outside had faded to a faint drizzle, and dawn crept in as a pale blue light through the small window. Nayeli stirred first, a slow shift under the blankets, followed by a tense breath as if her body wasn't sure whether it could trust the warmth around her. Elias leaned forward, cautious not to startle her. When her eyes opened, they didn't carry the panic of the night before. They carried confusion, exhaustion, and a quiet relief that surprised her. "You're awake," Elias said, his voice low, steady. She lifted a hand to her forehead, brushing aside a loose strand of hair. Her skin was warmer, not hot, not cold, just closer to normal. She looked around the room, piecing together what had happened. She noticed her dry clothes, the neat fold of her wet clothing near the hearth, and Elias's coat at the foot of her bed. "Did I collapse?" she asked, her voice rough from fever. "You ran yourself past your limit," Elias replied. "Rain, cold, no fire. You needed rest." Her eyes tightened with a flicker of embarrassment. The valley was harsh, and showing weakness felt dangerous. But she didn't apologize. Instead, she asked quietly, "How long have you been here?" "All night." She looked at him for a long moment. Her expression softened, not into gratitude she didn't know how to express, but into acceptance that he had done what needed to be done without expecting anything in return. Elias reached for a small cup of water he had set beside him. "Drink slow," he said, helping her lift herself enough to sip. Her hands trembled, but the water steadied her. He watched her closely, not with pity, but with attention. He needed to know if her strength was returning. She rested back against the pillow, breathing steadily. "I made it home late," she said. "The path flooded. I tried to start a fire, but I couldn't keep it lit. Everything was wet. I thought if I slept a little, I could try again." "How long since you ate?" Elias asked. She didn't answer immediately. Her silence told him enough. He stood, moving toward her small shelf where a few supplies were stored. He found dried meat, a handful of beans, and a sack of cracked corn. It wasn't enough for anyone recovering from sickness. Nayeli watched him with a tired, defensive look. You don't need to fix everything here. You need food, Elias answered simply. I'll make something warm. He didn't say more than necessary. Words weren't the focus. Survival was. While he worked near the stove, she tried to sit upright on her own. She managed only halfway before her arms weakened and she lay back down. Frustration crossed her face, subtle but sharp. She didn't like depending on someone. She didn't like anyone seeing her weak. Elias noticed. He didn't comment. He didn't draw attention to her struggle. Instead, he kept his tone practical. You walk through a storm with a fever. Your body needs time. Just breathe. Nayeli pressed her lips together, accepting the truth even if she disliked it. He made a thick broth using the last of her corn and beans, adding water from his canteen when he saw her bucket was nearly empty. As the steam rose, the air shifted. The room didn't feel as fragile as earlier. When he brought the bowl to her, she hesitated. Receiving help had never been comfortable for her. But her hands were unsteady and the hunger in her eyes betrayed her pride. Elias held the bowl steady while she ate, giving her enough space to feel in control, but staying close enough that she wouldn't spill or choke. Her breaths calmed between each bite. After a while she asked, "Why were you out near my land last night?" He answered plainly, "The fence near my creek collapsed. I was fixing it before dark. On the way home, your cabin looked cold. Didn't sit right." She considered this. Most people don't notice. I do. There was no emotion in his tone, but the honesty behind the words reached her more strongly than sympathy would have. As the morning brightened, Nayeli tried again to sit up. This time she managed, even though the movement caused a brief rush of dizziness. Elias steadied her, without touching her unless she leaned toward him first. She studied him, his quiet posture, his guarded eyes, the way he stayed alert even while sitting still. "You didn't have to stay," she said. "I know. Then why?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the fire, thinking. The truth felt heavier than the words themselves. "You were alone," he said finally. "Didn't feel right leaving you like that." It wasn't a dramatic confession. It was a simple statement from a man who had spent years avoiding the responsibility of caring for others because every failure from his past still weighed on him. But last night something shifted. Staying felt necessary. Not out of duty, but because letting someone freeze a mile from his land would be a burden he refused to carry. Nayeli absorbed his answer with a slow breath. The quiet between them wasn't tense or uncomfortable. It felt grounded, like two people who finally recognized that their lives had crossed paths for a reason they didn't yet understand. She looked toward the window. Weak daylight touched the frosted glass. Her land stretched out beyond it. Fences broken from wind, tools left outside, and livestock needing attention she wasn't well enough to give. Elias followed her gaze. "You won't be able to work today," he said. "I'll take care of your animals. After that, I'll bring more wood and clean water." She didn't argue. She didn't have the strength. Instead, she spoke with quiet honesty. "Thank you for last night." Elias nodded once. It was enough. He stood, grabbed his hat from the table, and paused at the door. "I won't go far," he said. Then he stepped outside into the cold morning air, leaving the fire burning warm behind him. For the first time since her husband's death, the cabin no longer felt like a place where she survived alone. Elias crossed the small yard outside Nayeli's cabin with a clear purpose. The morning air carried a sharp bite, and patches of frozen mud cracked under his boots as he walked toward her shed. He fed the goats first, counting them out of habit. All were thin, one limping slightly. Their water trough held a thin layer of ice. He broke it with a stone, watching the animals drink as if they hadn't tasted fresh water in days. It gave him a clearer picture of how long Nayeli had been struggling without admitting it. He checked the fence next. Wind damage from the storm had pushed 2 posts inward, forming a gap wide enough for coyotes. He set the boards back in place and braced them temporarily with rope. Repairs would need stronger wood, something her land no longer had. He added that to the list forming in his mind: repairs, supplies, food, medical herbs, and anything that would keep her from slipping into danger again. By the time he returned to the cabin, his coat was dusted with frost. He paused on the porch, brushing it off before stepping inside. The room was warmer now. The fire crackled with steady flames. Nayeli sat upright with her back against the wall, her posture tense but stronger than earlier. She had managed to braid her damp hair, though her movements were still slow. "You shouldn't be up," Elias said. "I can sit," she replied. Her voice carried more air than strength, but she was alert. She watched him closely, studying his expression. "How bad is it outside?" He removed his hat and set on the table. "Your animals need feed. The fence will hold for now, but it needs real fixing. Water's fine. Land's soaked. Nothing we can't handle." Nayeli nodded, though her eyes tightened. She understood the weight behind his simple words. Struggling land meant struggling people, and she had been fighting alone for far longer than she admitted. After a quiet moment, she asked, "How did you know what to do so quickly last night?" Elias sat down across from her, resting his forearms on his knees. He didn't look away from her question. "I've seen enough sickness to know what cold and fever can turn into if you leave it alone." She studied him, waiting for more. It wasn't curiosity for gossip. It was the need to understand who was sitting in her home, helping her with a seriousness that didn't match the casual acquaintance they had before. Elias continued after a slow breath. "I spent years riding with men who didn't always survive winter wounds. Learned fast or lost people. That's the truth of it." Nayeli's gaze softened. "You lost someone." He didn't answer immediately. His jaw shifted, a sign he was weighing how much of his history belonged in the room. He wasn't a man who shared easily, but her tone wasn't prying. It was steady, respectful. "Yes," he said finally, "my brother." The quiet that followed wasn't heavy. It was real, grounded, and honest. Nayeli lowered her eyes. "My husband died fighting for this land," she said quietly. "Not the soil itself, but the right to exist on it without being pushed out." Elias looked up at her, his expression tightening with understanding. "Who's pushing you now?" She hesitated. Her fingers gripped the edge of the blanket. "Ranchers from the South Valley," she said. "They come every few weeks. They offer money, not enough to start a life anywhere else. They remind me I'm alone now." Her voice did not tremble, but her breath shortened. "Last month they broke that same section of fence you repaired today. Told me it could happen again." Elias felt a slow rise of anger, not the kind that clouded thought, but the kind that anchored it. He had seen men like that, men who tested boundaries until they found someone too tired or too scared to fight back. Nayeli continued speaking, her tone calm but tight. "I didn't tell anyone. People here have their own burdens. I didn't want trouble for them, and I didn't want pity." Elias leaned back slightly, absorbing every word. He now understood why her food stores were low, why her land was neglected, why she pushed herself into the storm last night instead of asking for help. This wasn't just sickness or winter. It was pressure wearing her down piece by piece. "You're not alone," he said quietly. Nayeli looked at him, searching for the meaning behind the words. He didn't add anything, but the firmness in his eyes told her he wasn't offering comfort. He was stating a fact he intended to uphold. She took a slow breath, letting the tension in her shoulders ease. "The men might return soon," she said. "They believe I can be frightened off." Elias stood and added a log to the fire, his movements controlled. "Let them come," he said. "You won't be facing them sick and freezing on your own. That ends now." Nayeli watched the flames brighten. For the first time in months, the cabin didn't feel threatened by the quiet. It felt defended. Her strength wasn't fully back yet, and her past wasn't done pressing on her, but the room felt steadier. The air wasn't filled with fear or exhaustion. It held something else, practical hope, shaped not by promises but by actions. Elias turned toward the door. "I'll go to my place and bring back supplies. You'll need more than soup to recover. Stay warm. Keep resting. I'll return before the sun drops." She nodded, letting herself lean back against the wall. "Be careful on the road," she said softly. He paused for a moment, meeting her eyes. "I always am." Then he stepped outside, closing the door behind him as the fire continued to glow in the cabin he intended to keep safe. The trail back to Nayeli's cabin had hardened under the cold by the time Elias returned. Snow clung to the edges of his boots, and the sack of supplies over his shoulder pressed against his spine as he stepped onto her porch. He heard nothing inside. No coughing, No shifting, no weak footsteps, and for a moment he feared her fever had turned. He opened the door quietly. Nayeli was awake, sitting at the small table with a blanket over her shoulders. She had managed to grind dried corn with the stone mortar, though her movements were slow and unsteady. Her breathing sounded stable, not strong but steady enough that Elias felt the tightness in his chest ease. "You're pushing yourself," he said, setting the supplies on the table. She wiped her hands on the blanket. "I needed to move. Lying down made my thoughts louder than they should be." Elias understood that better than he was willing to say. Rest wasn't easy when the mind carried every threat and memory without pause. He unpacked the sack, dried meat, flour, herbs for fever, and a small bundle of tools. Nayeli's eyes paused on the tools, and a question formed in her expression before she spoke it. "Why bring all that? Your fence won't hold long," he said. "I'll rebuild it today before the ground freezes harder. It'll give you a few solid weeks." She nodded, though her face carried a mixture of gratitude and unease. Accepting help was not part of how she had survived this long. Elias didn't comment on her hesitation. He simply placed the herbs by the fire and tended to the coals. "You need food before anything else," he said. "I can cook. You need to breathe. I'll handle it." Nayeli didn't argue this time. Her body leaned back against the chair, as if it had been waiting for permission to rest. While a pot of stew simmered, Elias stepped outside to assess the land more closely. The ground around the cabin told a longer story than she had spoken aloud. The soil was compacted near the path, not from her footsteps, but from hooves. Several horses had come through recently, forming distinct tracks. Not ranch hands checking boundaries. Visitors with intent. He walked the perimeter, studying each sign. The tracks circled the cabin, stopped near the shed, and looped back toward the south trail. Whoever came hadn't been lost. They had been inspecting. When he returned, Nayeli was warming her hands by the fire. She noticed the change in his expression before he said anything. "There were horses here 3 days ago," Elias said. She lowered her gaze. "They came asking again." His jaw shifted with a controlled tension. "Did they threaten you?" "They said the winter would be hard. That someone alone shouldn't hold land she can't defend." Anger pushed a heat into his chest, but he kept his voice even. "They're testing you, seeing how weak they think you've become." She nodded once. "I didn't tell them I was sick. They don't need to know, and they won't." Elias handed her a bowl of stew. The smell of warm broth filled the room. She ate slowly, her hands still trembling but her eyes clearing with each spoonful. As she ate, she finally asked something she had held back for days. "Why do you care what happens here?" Elias sat across from her. He didn't look away from her question. "Because this valley has taken enough from both of us. I'm not letting it strip you down too." Her breath caught slightly, not from surprise, but from recognition. She saw in him the same quiet battle she fought every day, holding ground not because it was easy, but because leaving meant surrendering something bigger than land. After the meal, Elias worked outside for hours. He dug new post holes, lifted heavy timber, and measured each section with calm precision. Nayeli watched from inside, her face lit faintly by the fire as she sipped the herb tea he prepared. When the wind shifted, carrying a sharp gust across the yard, she stood and wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She stepped outside, even though she still felt weak. "You don't need to be out here," Elias said without stopping his work. "I want to see what you're building," she answered. She walked slowly toward the fence. Her steps were careful, not because she feared falling, but because she was adjusting to having someone else in her space, someone who worked without demanding anything back. Elias hammered a final beam in place. The sound echoed across the valley. Nayeli inspected the new structure. The posts were firm, the board straight, the line clean. "This will hold," she said. "For a long while," Elias replied. She watched him for a moment, then asked, "How long do you plan to help me?" "Until you can handle things again," he said. His tone was simple, not dramatic. "And longer if you want it." Nayeli looked away, her eyes tightening not from discomfort, but from the slow realization that she didn't need to live the next season alone. She didn't speak for several seconds. When she finally did, her voice was steady. This land feels different today. It should, Elias said. It's defended now. Later, as the sun dropped behind the ridge, they both sat inside near the fire. The warmth was steady, no longer fading in and out. Nayeli's fever had lowered. Her strength returned in small but visible ways. Her shoulders no longer slumped, her breathing steadier, her eyes clearer. You should go rest, she said gently. You've worked all day. I'm staying here tonight, he replied. Storm's coming. You shouldn't be alone. She didn't argue. Instead, she adjusted her blanket and watched the flames rise. The room was quiet, but the quiet no longer felt like something heavy pressing on her chest. It felt stable. For the first time since her husband's death, someone else had stepped in her life not with demands or pity, but with steady action and unspoken resolve. Elias sat in the chair he had occupied the night before, the fire lighting the tired lines on his face. He wasn't a visitor anymore. He was part of the cabin, part of its safety, part of its routine, part of its future, even if neither of them said it yet. The wind strengthened after nightfall, pushing hard against the cabin walls as Elias added another log to the fire. The flames rose in slow waves, lighting the room with a steady amber glow. Nayeli rested on her bed, wrapped in blankets, her breathing calmer than the night before. Elias could see she was physically stronger, but her eyes held a tension he hadn't seen earlier. She watched the window as if listening for something only she could hear. The storm struck suddenly. A burst of wind rattled the shutters, followed by a deep crack of thunder rolling across the valley. The cabin trembled lightly. Elias turned toward Nayeli, expecting her to flinch at the noise, but what he saw instead tightened his chest. Her hands gripped the blanket with a sharp, involuntary tremor. Her breathing quickened. Her eyes fixed on the door, wide and unfocused. Nayeli, he asked, stepping closer. She didn't look at him. Her chest rose and fell too fast, her shoulders tightening as if bracing for something violent. Elias recognized the signs: panic, memory, fear that didn't belong to the room, but to another night she carried inside her. It's just the storm, he said quietly. Her voice was barely audible. It sounded the same that night. He stopped moving. She had never spoken about her husband's death beyond a single sentence. But now the edges of that buried moment were surfacing. He knelt beside her, keeping enough distance that she didn't feel trapped. You're safe here, he said. Nayeli squeezed her eyes shut. They broke the fence first. Then they fired shots to scare us. The thunder, it felt like that. Her breathing grew shallow again, fear pushing away the calm she had gained over the past days. Elias kept his voice steady. There's no one outside. No riders. No guns. Just wind and rain. She didn't fully hear him. Memories pulled her deeper. Cold, fear, the sound of men circling the cabin she once shared with her husband. Elias saw her fingers tremble uncontrollably. She wasn't weak. She was remembering a night where she had been pushed to fight for everything she loved. He moved slightly closer. Look at me, he said, his tone steady but gentle. It took a few seconds before she lifted her eyes. When she did, Elias held her gaze without blinking. Stay with me. Not with whatever happened outside that night. Her breathing slowed, but she still looked pale. Another crash of thunder made her jolt. Elias didn't touch her without permission, but he shifted closer so she wouldn't feel alone in the darkness. Your husband, what happened? He asked softly. She swallowed hard, her throat tight. They came asking for the land again. We told them no. They came back angry. Her voice shook, but she forced herself to continue. We thought they would only scare us. My husband went outside to talk. Her hands pressed against the blanket. He didn't come back. The storm outside grew harsher, but the room felt still. Elias didn't speak. He let her get the words out without interruption. I buried him behind the cedar tree, she said. I told myself I would hold this land alone, that I didn't need anyone. Her voice broke, not dramatically, but in a quiet, worn-out way that came from holding too much for too long. Elias felt a heaviness settle in his chest. He understood the stubbornness, the loneliness, the refusal to show weakness. He had lived inside the same walls of silence after losing his brother. But watching her struggle to breathe through panic made his own wounds feel smaller than he'd ever allowed himself to admit. He kept his voice low. You didn't lose that fight. You're still here. They didn't break you. Naeli's shoulders tensed again as thunder rolled overhead. Elias made a calm decision. He reached out slowly, letting her see his hand clearly before placing it lightly on her forearm. A small gesture, a grounding point, something real and warm to pull her out of the memory. She didn't pull away. Her breathing steadied under his touch. Focus on the fire, he said quietly. Right here, right now. She followed his instruction, staring at the flame until her lungs began to settle. Her trembling decreased, the panic loosening its grip. After a long silence, she whispered, I don't know how to let someone help me without feeling like I'm failing. You're not failing, Elias said. You're recovering. That's different. Another long silence filled the cabin. This one calmer, shaped by the steady crackle of fire instead of fear. She leaned slightly toward him, not collapsing, not seeking comfort, but making a choice to let herself rest near someone for the first time in a year. Elias didn't move away. He didn't say anything reassuring or sentimental. He simply stayed as a steady presence beside her, keeping her anchored. Outside, the storm eventually softened. The thunder drifted farther across the valley. The wind eased into a muted whistle along the roof. Inside, Naeli's breathing returned to normal, her eyes heavier with exhaustion rather than panic. You stayed, she murmured, her voice almost gone. I told you I would, Elias replied. She nodded slowly, closing her eyes. I'm not used to people keeping promises. You'll get used to it, he said, settling back into the chair beside her bed as she drifted towards sleep. The storm passed. The cabin grew quiet again. For the first time since her husband's death, Naeli fell asleep, knowing someone would watch the night for her. And Elias didn't look toward the door or the road. His attention remained on her breathing, steady and controlled, because leaving her alone in fear was no longer something he was willing to do. The morning after the storm arrived with a hard, bitter cold that settled into the valley like a warning. The sky held a pale, washed-out color, and the air felt dense, as if the weather itself was waiting for something to happen. Elias stepped outside before sunrise, scanning the land with sharp attention. The storm had left branches scattered across the yard, the fence damp but still holding, and the ground marked with fresh puddles. Nothing seemed immediately threatening, yet the silence carried an edge he didn't trust. He checked the animals, split another stack of firewood, and filled 2 buckets with clean water from the small spring near the cedar tree. When he re-entered the cabin, Naeli was already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed with her hands resting quietly in her lap. Her fever had faded even further, and her eyes looked clear, though still tired. You're early, she said. Couldn't sleep, Elias answered, setting the water down. Storm left a lot to fix. Naeli gave a faint nod, studying him. She noticed the subtle tension in his posture, how he kept glancing toward the door, how his hand hovered near his belt, though there was no immediate danger inside. You're expecting something, she said. Just being cautious, he replied. Weather like this brings people out. She knew what he meant. The ranchers who wanted her land preferred approaching when conditions were harsh. It made resistance weaker. Naeli stood slowly. If they come, I'll stand with you. You will, Elias said, meeting her eyes. But not while sick. Let me take the front if anything starts. She didn't argue. Not because she felt weak, but because she recognized that he wasn't trying to take control. He was protecting the ground they now shared responsibility for. He poured her a cup of warm tea and brought it to her. Drink. It will keep your strength steady. As she lifted the cup, something outside shifted. Hoofbeats. Slow, deliberate, approaching from the south trail. Both of them turned toward the window at the same time. They're here, Naeli said quietly. Elias stepped to the door, pulling on his coat with calm precision. He didn't rush, but he didn't hesitate either. Stay inside, he said. If they want a conversation, they can have it with me. Naeli took a breath to steady herself. Don't let them provoke you. I won't, he said, but I won't let them intimidate you either. He opened the door and stepped out into the open air. 3 men on horseback approached the front gate. Their coats were heavy, trimmed with dust from the long ride, and their horses were restless beneath them. Elias recognized one of them. Calver, a man known in the valley for pushing boundaries until someone pushed back harder. The other 2 looked like hired hands, older, hardened by work, and carrying rifles slung casually as if they were part of their bodies. Calver leaned forward in his saddle. "Morning, Ward," he said, voice smug. "Didn't expect to see you on this side of the valley." Elias stood firmly, his boots planted shoulder-width apart. "This land isn't yours," he said. "You shouldn't be here." Calver smirked. "We came to check on Miss Naeli. Heard she's been struggling." "She's fine," Elias replied. "And she doesn't need visitors." The 2 hired men exchanged a look, measuring Elias's stance. Calver narrowed his eyes. Funny thing, the moment a woman loses her husband, people start circling her land. Makes you wonder who she can rely on. Elias didn't flinch. "She relies on herself. I'm just helping her recover from a storm." Calver's smile thinned. "Storms come and go. Some hit harder than others." He leaned back in the saddle, his tone growing sharper. "You rebuilding her fence yesterday? That was kind of you. But you didn't ask who broke it." "I don't need to ask," Elias said. "I know who rides through here." The hired men shifted their weight, hands brushing near their holsters, not drawing but testing tension. Elias kept his expression steady, his posture calm. He didn't reach for his weapon. His control bothered them more than aggression would have. Calver's smile flickered. "We came with an offer," he said. "Last time we spoke with her, she wasn't feeling very cooperative. Maybe now she sees the sense in selling before winter worsens." "No sale," Elias said plainly. Calver raised an eyebrow. "You speaking for her? She doesn't need to speak to men who show up armed at her gate." A long silence settled between them, shaped by the cold air and the quiet defiance in Elias's tone. The horses snorted and shifted, sensing the mood. Calver leaned forward again, voice low. "You think you can protect her from everything? You're one man." "That's enough," Elias said. Naeli stepped out of the cabin then, blanket over her shoulders, standing behind Elias, but visible enough to show she wasn't hiding. Calver's eyes flicked toward her, assessing her strength, her posture, and the absence of fear in her stance. She spoke clearly. "My answer is the same as before. I'm not selling. You have no right to be on my land." Calver's expression soured. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "No," she said. "You are." Elias didn't move, but the shift in his shoulders made it clear that the conversation was over. Calver clicked his tongue and pulled the reins. "We'll come back," he said. "Think this through before then." "We'll be ready," Elias replied. The men turned their horses and rode away, the sound of hooves fading slowly down the trail. Elias watched until they disappeared behind the ridge. Naeli stepped closer to him. Her breath released shakily, though her expression stayed steady. "They'll return," she said. "Yes," Elias answered, "but they won't walk over this land again." She looked at him, seeing the certainty in his posture, the controlled anger beneath the surface, and the promise he hadn't spoken aloud, but made clear through every action since the night he found her. For the first time, the threat didn't make her feel small, because she wasn't facing it alone now. Elias opened the gate and walked back toward the cabin with her, the cold air settling behind them as if the land itself recognized that something had changed. 2 people now stood against what once overwhelmed one. The cold settled deeper into the valley after Calver and his men disappeared beyond the ridge. Elias and Naeli walked back to the cabin without speaking, both aware that the men's departure wasn't an end. It was a pause. The threat remained, and the next visit would come with more pressure. The air inside the cabin felt warmer than the tension outside, but an uneasiness lingered. Naeli set the blanket aside and sat at the table. The storm from the night before, the panic, the fever, the confrontation, everything weighed on her body. Still, her posture remained steady. Elias removed his coat and hung it near the fire, watching her with quiet observation. "They'll try again," she said. "They never leave something alone once they've claimed it in their minds." "They don't claim this," Elias replied. "Not while I'm here." She studied him, her eyes clear but filled with something he hadn't seen before. a mixture of concern and determination. You shouldn't put yourself at risk for me. It isn't just for you, Elias said. The valley changes if men like that win. Everyone loses ground, not just the one they push first. Nayeli lowered her gaze. She knew he was right. Calver's type didn't stop at one victory. They found the next vulnerable person, the next piece of land, the next quiet voice they believed they could silence. Her husband had fought alone, believing the law would come in time. It never did. Elias sat across from her. His hands were steady, but there was a line of tension across his shoulders, controlled, focused, but present. We need to prepare, he said. Nayeli looked up. Prepare how? By making it clear that this land isn't weak, Elias explained. They came believing you'd fall back when threatened. We proved the opposite. She hesitated. I don't want bloodshed. Neither do I, Elias said. Violence attracts more violence. But protection doesn't have to escalate. It has to be visible. Nayeli exhaled softly. Tell me what you have in mind. Elias leaned forward. His plan was simple but practical. Reinforce the fence properly, secure the doors with stronger beams, make sure supplies were stored so no threat could starve them out, and ensure that the property showed signs of active care. Fresh wood piles, repaired sheds, mended fences. A well-maintained home signaled strength, not abandonment. Nayeli listened carefully. I can help with some of that, she said. You'll help when you're strong enough, Elias replied. Today, you stay warm. You're still recovering. She didn't argue. Instead, she watched him gather tools and supplies, as if preparing for a job he had taken on long before he admitted it. His movements were calm, practiced, as though building stability for someone else gave him a sense of direction he hadn't felt in years. When he stepped outside to start reinforcing the gate, Nayeli followed to the doorway. Elias. He turned. If they come again, she said, I want to stand beside you. This is my land. I need to protect it too. He studied her for a moment, recognizing the resolve in her voice. You will, when the time comes. The day passed in steady work. Elias rebuilt the gate with thick beams and crossbars, shaping it into something that sent a clear message to anyone approaching. He replaced old nails, tightened hinge bolts, and reinforced the joints. Nayeli, though still weak, sorted tools, cleaned the shed entrance, and organized the small pile of firewood with slow but deliberate movements. Each action reconnected her to her land, reminding her that she was not a passive victim of circumstance. As the sun dipped low, Elias stood back from the gate, examining his work. The structure looked solid, grounded, and protective, something that could withstand force without collapsing at the first push. When Nayeli stepped beside him, she nodded approvingly. It looks stronger, she said. It is, Elias answered. She looked out across the valley, the fading light casting steady shadows across the land. My husband always wanted this place to be something that outlived danger, she said quietly. He worked the soil every day believing it could be safe. Elias listened, understanding that this wasn't about the land alone. It was about preserving the last piece of a life that had been taken from her. He didn't offer comforting words. Instead, he spoke with the same grounded honesty he used for everything else. You're keeping it safe, he said, not because you have to, but because it matters to you. Nayeli turned toward him. Does it matter to you? He met her gaze without hesitation. Yes. The answer hung in the cold air, not adorned, not softened, not explained further. It was simple truth, and she accepted it with a small nod. They returned inside, just as the temperature dropped sharply. Elias lit the lantern and added fuel to the fire. Nayeli sat near the warmth, her tiredness clear but not overwhelming. Elias pulled a chair closer, not directly beside her, but close enough that she felt his presence without feeling crowded. You said something earlier, she said quietly, that this valley changes if those men win. What did you mean? Elias thought for a moment before answering. When people see someone alone being pushed, they assume it's safer to stay quiet. That fear spreads. I've seen it in other towns. One threat leads to another. If we stand firm now, it stops before it grows. Nayeli absorbed his words. You've seen this before? Enough times, Elias said. Sometimes I fought it. Sometimes I turn away. His jaw tightened. Turning away always cost more. Naeli didn't push for details. His voice carried history, loss, guilt, choices he wished he had made differently. She recognized a part of herself in that wait. After a long pause, she said, "I'm glad you didn't turn away this time." Elias looked into the fire. "Me too." The night settled more softly than the one before. No storm pounded the walls. No panic rose in the silence. Instead, the cabin held a quiet sense of purpose. Their roles were shifting, from caretaker and patient to partners preparing for a shared challenge. Naeli laid down to rest again, her breathing calm and even. Elias remained awake in the chair, keeping watch not because danger felt immediate, but because it felt right. The land outside was still, the darkness steady, the future uncertain, but no longer something either of them faced alone. Two lives that had spent years surviving in isolation were beginning to form something stronger, a decision to stand together, not out of desperation, but out of recognition. The valley no longer felt divided between two separate cabins. It felt like one defended home. The next morning arrived with a heavy stillness. The valley was quiet, the kind of quiet that made Elias step onto the porch before the sun fully cleared the ridge. He scanned the landscape the way a man does when he expects trouble, not with fear, but with calculation. The reinforced gate stood firm, the shed secured, the animals moving calmly. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the air held a weight that hadn't been there the day before. Naeli stepped beside him, wrapped in a thicker blanket. Her fever was gone, and although her body was still weak, her eyes showed a steady resolve. "They'll come today," she said. Elias didn't question how she knew. "I'm ready." "So am I," she answered. He looked at her, measuring her strength. She wasn't fully recovered, but she wasn't fragile either. She stood straight, breathing steadily. The blanket held around her shoulders not as a shield, but as a practical necessity against the cold. She wasn't hiding anymore. Elias opened the door for her to sit near the fire, but she shook her head. "I want to be outside when they come. Then you'll stand beside me," he said. Naeli nodded once. It wasn't defiance, it was choice. Hours passed. They prepared without speaking much. Elias checked the tools again, making sure the gate beam slid easily into place. Naeli moved slowly through the yard, gathering what she could carry: dried herbs, spare cloth, small items she didn't want broken or taken. She paused near the cedar tree, placing her hand quietly on the bark. Elias noticed and understood. She was reminding herself that fear would not force her away again. Around midday, the familiar sound of hooves began to carry across the valley. Elias's hand hovered near his holster, not to draw, but to be ready. Naeli stepped to his side, blanket still around her shoulders, her breath steady despite the tension gathering in her chest. Four riders approached this time. Calver rode in front, wearing a smug look that told Elias he believed today he would walk away with land that didn't belong to him. The other three carried rifles openly, not raised, but visible enough to convey intent. Calver slowed his horse at the gate. "Looks different around here," he said, scanning the reinforced beams. "Someone's been busy keeping the land in shape," Elias replied. Calver eyed him with annoyance. "You've taken quite an interest in this place." Elias didn't rise to the bait. "I'm here because I choose to be." Naeli spoke next, her voice clear. "State your purpose." Calver smiled in a slow, mocking way. "You know why we're here. Last offer. Take our price, or the winter will do worse than we will." She stepped forward a half step. "The land stays with me." Calver's expression shifted. No more smiles, no false civility. "You're making a mistake." Elias answered before Naeli could. "Enough. You've come with threats twice now. Third time won't end the way you want." One of the hired men leaned slightly forward in his saddle. "You planning to stop four of us by yourself?" Elias kept his voice measured. "I won't need to." The man frowned, confused, until voices rose at the edge of the valley. Two neighboring ranchers, men Elias knew by sight but seldom spoke to, were walking down the path with rifles resting casually over their shoulders. Behind them came another pair from the eastern trail. They weren't drawn in by some cry for help. They had seen riders heading toward Naeli's land armed again and decided not to let the valley fall into the hands of bullies. Calver's jaw tightened. You call them? No, Elias said. They came because they live here too. Naeli's voice remained calm. This valley has room for everyone, but not for theft. The standoff shifted. Calver realized he no longer stood before a lone woman or a single man guarding her land. He faced a valley prepared to push back. The confidence drained from his face, replaced by a simmering anger he struggled to hide. This isn't over, he muttered. It is, Elias answered. You tried twice. That's enough. Calver stared at Naeli one last time, searching for fear. He found none. She stood straight, the blanket around her shoulders, the cold air rising for the ground around her, eyes forward and unbroken. He yanked the reins abruptly. Let's go, he snapped to his men. The riders turned and left, their horses kicking up frozen dirt as they retreated toward the south trail. No one followed them. No one needed to. The moment they disappeared behind the distant ridge, the valley exhaled. The tension that had stretched tight since dawn loosened quickly. Elias turned to Naeli. It's done. She lowered her shoulders, not collapsing, not relief in a dramatic wave, but a steady release of a weight she had carried far too long. They won't come back, she said. No, Elias replied. They won't risk this again. The neighbors approached, offering calm nods, a few quiet words, and firm handshakes before heading home. None stayed long, none pried into details. They helped simply because it was right. Elias appreciated that. When the yard fell quiet again, Naeli stepped beside Elias, looking at the gate, the valley, the land that had nearly been taken from her. You stayed, she said softly. I told you I would, he replied. Her eyes held a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and something deeper, gratitude shaped not by dependency, but by respect. I couldn't have faced them alone. You didn't, Elias said. The wind brushed across the reinforced fence, carrying the familiar scent of winter pine from the ridge. No threat in the valley felt close anymore. No danger pressed at her door. For the first time since her husband's death, Naeli felt safe. Not because the world had grown kinder, but because someone had chosen to stand with her, shoulder to shoulder, without hesitation. The land remained hers. Her strength remained intact, and Elias remained by her side, as naturally as if he had always belonged there. The morning after the confrontation arrived with calm light spreading across the valley. The cold was still sharp, but the tension that had gripped the land for days had faded. Elias stepped outside early, out of habit more than necessity, scanning the ridge and listening for anything unusual. There were no hoofbeats, no dust trails, no signs of riders circling the property. The valley felt still in a way that wasn't empty, just peaceful. Naeli opened the cabin door a few minutes later. She wore her thicker buckskin jacket, the color softened from years of use, and her hair was tied back in a simple braid. She walked slowly at first, testing the strength in her legs. The fever was gone entirely now. Her breathing was steady. The weight she carried in her shoulders, fear, exhaustion, uncertainty, had lightened in ways she didn't try to hide. Elias glanced at her. How are you feeling? Like my body finally remembers how to stand, she said. It's strange to wake up without fear pressing at my throat. Elias nodded once. No one's coming back. You're safe. She looked around the yard. At the reinforced gate, the strong fence line, the tidy stack of wood, the shed Elias had repaired, the clear footprints from the neighbors who had stood with them. The valley showed up, she said quietly. I didn't expect that. They weren't helping you only, Elias answered. They were showing Calver that the valley isn't his to shape. Naeli considered that for a moment. Still, they could have stayed out of it. Many would have. Elias didn't argue. He knew how often people chose an action out of fear or convenience. What mattered was that this time they hadn't. And he understood something else. Those men would not have come if they believed Naeli was truly alone. His presence had changed more than just the physical safety of her land. It had changed how others saw her situation. She stepped closer to Elias, her expression thoughtful. You were right, she said. Strength isn't just surviving alone. It's knowing when to let someone stand beside you. Elias didn't say anything at first. He looked out toward the ridge as the sun slowly warmed the snow. You didn't let me stand beside you, he said finally. You chose to. She accepted the clarification with a slight narrowing of her eyes, the kind of look that acknowledged truth rather than resisted it. They spent the rest of the morning repairing the last of the storm damage. Elias lifted heavy beams and reset a post near the water trough, while Nayeli fetched smaller tools, organized supplies, and cleared broken branches from the yard. Their teamwork was natural, quiet, and steady, neither instructing the other, neither trying to lead. It had the rhythm of two people who had learned each other's pace and worked within it. When Nayeli knelt to clear debris near the cedar tree, she paused, pressing her hand against the wood. Elias walked over, noticing the softness in her expression. You thinking about him? He asked. Yes, she said, but not in the same way as before. Elias waited. I've been trying to protect this place alone because I thought it honored him, she said. But I see now, the land doesn't survive because one person refuses to fall. It survives because people choose to stay. Elias felt something shift in him, quiet, solid, and unexpected. He wasn't used to being part of someone's rebuilding. For years, he had avoided anything that looked like connection. Yet here he was, firmly rooted in a place that wasn't his, helping someone who no longer felt like a stranger. He'd be proud of you, Elias said. The land is still yours. Your life is still yours. Nayeli nodded. And yours. Elias hesitated, not from doubt, but from the weight of the question. My life hasn't belonged anywhere for a long time, he said. But this place, it feels like something I can stand for without losing myself. Nayeli looked at him steadily, the hint of a small breath escaping her. Then stay, not out of obligation, not because of danger. Stay because you want to. Elias held her gaze, the cold air settling around them, the valley stretching in quiet lines toward the horizon. He didn't answer immediately. He let the silence settle as an honest space between them. I'm not going anywhere, he said. They finished the day with small chores that didn't carry urgency, filling the water barrels, repairing loose boards on the shed, res-tacking wood. Nayeli's strength improved steadily, and Elias found himself watching her not with concern, but with a kind of quiet respect. She wasn't the same woman he found shaking beneath a thin blanket. She wasn't the woman desperate to hold everything together alone. She was someone rebuilding herself from within, one breath at a time. As the sun set, they shared a simple meal by the fire. Nayeli prepared it, slowly, carefully, but with a clear intention to reclaim her rhythm. Elias chopped herbs without being asked, passed tools when needed, and stood near enough to steady her when she swayed. After they ate, she sat with her back against the wall, watching the fire with a relaxed posture he hadn't seen before. Elias sat in the same chair he had occupied the first night, but the room no longer held tension between them. It felt lived in, shared. Nayeli spoke softly. When the storm hit, I thought I was falling apart. I thought I wasn't strong enough to face any of this. You were strong, Elias said. Fear doesn't change that. I wasn't alone, she replied. He didn't respond, but he didn't need to. For the first time in months, the cabin wasn't just a shelter. It felt like a place where life could begin again, quietly, slowly, and without fear pressing on the walls. Outside, the valley rested. Inside, two lives that had been broken in different ways were beginning to form something steady. Not a promise, not a declaration, just the beginnings of a life built side by side, with no reason to walk away. The first signs of spring appeared slowly across the valley. The snow thinned near the fence line. Patches of brown earth pushed through in uneven shapes, and the air carried a softer edge when the sun climbed over the ridge. Elias noticed the change early in the season, tiny details he'd learned to read after years of working land that didn't always give back what it took. The valley was waking, and with it came a shift in the way both he and Nayeli moved through each day. There were no more riders on the southern trail, no watching eyes at a distance, no tension lingering around the edges of the property. The danger was gone, and the land felt open again, as if relieved to return to its natural quiet. Naeli stepped outside each morning, her steps steady, her breathing full, her strength restored. She carried herself differently now, still quiet, still grounded in her own space, but no longer carrying the heavy fear that once shaped every decision she made. Her life was no longer lived under threat. The land was hers without question. One morning, as she fed the goats near the shed, she saw Elias moving belongings from his horse to the small lean-to beside the cabin. His bedding roll, a saddlebag filled with tools, a worn coat that had seen years of hard travel. She watched him for a moment before approaching. "You're moving in," she said, not surprised but wanting to hear him say it. Elias paused, tightening a rope over his belongings. "I figured there's no sense riding back and forth every day. More work here than I thought." Naeli folded her arms lightly, studying the way he avoided looking directly at her. "Is that the only reason?" He stopped what he was doing, letting the coil of rope rest in his hand. His voice dropped to a quieter tone. "I want to be here, not just passing through, not just for repairs or trouble." Naeli nodded slowly. Her eyes softened with understanding he didn't need to explain. "Then this is your home, too." Elias held her gaze. There was no tension, no hesitation, only the calm certainty of two people who had lived long enough to recognize when something real had formed between them. The days that followed unfolded with an ease neither had experienced in years. They worked side by side, repairing the last winter damage, cleaning out the shed, replanting small patches of land that once grew vegetables but had gone dry. Naeli taught Elias how her husband used to lay out the early planting rows. Elias showed her practical shortcuts for reinforcing the barn door and making feed last longer through cold spells. In quiet moments, they shared small pieces of themselves, not dramatic confessions, just simple truths that helped them understand each other fully. Elias spoke of the guilt he carried over his brother's death, the fight he hadn't stopped, the night he had wished he could relive. Naeli listened without judgment, and when she placed her hand lightly over his, it was not comfort he felt, it was release. Naeli shared the parts of her grief she had never spoken aloud. The nights she had stayed awake waiting for footsteps that never returned, the way the valley felt too large after losing someone she loved, and the weight of holding a whole life together with no one to steady her. Elias didn't offer explanations or advice. He simply sat with her in the quiet, letting the truth settle between them without pressure. Their connection didn't need declarations. It was visible in the way they moved through the same space without questioning each other's presence. As spring grew warmer, Elias began building an addition to the cabin, a small room attached to the west side, framed with timber he hauled from the ridge. Naeli watched him from the porch, her expression a mix of curiosity and quiet emotion. "What is it for?" she asked when he measured the doorway. Elias rested the piece of wood against the wall. "A second room, for storage, tool space." He paused, then added, "There should be room for two people living here, not one." She understood what he meant. He wasn't asking for permission. He was shaping a shared life in wood and nails. Naeli touched the doorframe with her fingers, feeling the fresh cut of the timber. "It's good," she said. "It makes the house feel whole." Elias met her gaze. "So do you." She didn't look away. Instead, she stepped closer, the warmth of the afternoon sun catching the edges of her braid, the quiet of the valley surrounding them. There was no dramatic embrace, no sudden confession, just two people standing close enough to feel the steady presence of the other, something they had both lived without for too long. That evening, Naeli placed a small wooden box on the table. Elias recognized it, the one she kept beside her bed, containing her husband's necklace, wrapped carefully in cloth. She opened the lid, looked at the necklace for a long moment, then closed it gently. She placed the box on a shelf near the wall. Elias understood without her saying anything. The gesture wasn't about letting go. It was about letting the past rest without shutting it away. When she turned toward him, her voice held no sadness. "This home has room for what came before. And what comes next?" Elias stepped closer. "What comes next?" She didn't answer with words. She simply took his hand, not as a request, not as a question, but as a choice, one made slowly, steadily, and with full clarity. The warmth of her hand fit naturally against his. No trembling, no hesitation. It felt like the completion of something that had begun the night. He found her cold and shaking, a moment that neither of them had expected to shape their future. As night settled, they sat on the porch overlooking the valley. Smoke rose from the chimney behind them, steady and warm. The light from inside spilled softly onto the ground, leaving the yard bathed in calm brightness. Elias spoke quietly. "You're not alone anymore. And you're not wandering anymore," she replied. A simple truth for both of them. The valley stretched before them, no longer a place of isolation or threat, but a home shaped by two people who had survived loss, carried grief, rebuilt broken ground, and found something steady in each other. There were no more unanswered questions, no fear waiting in the shadows, no uncertainty about what they meant to one another. Their lives, once fractured in different ways, now rested in the same place, chosen, shared, and firmly rooted. The fire inside the cabin burned evenly, glow spreading across the wooden walls, warm and bright. For the first time in a long time, both of them knew they would face every season from here on together.